Bet the Board presents Stay Green. Stay Green is your first stop for all the metrics, matchups, and money-making opportunities at the track each race week. This is Stay Green, the NASCAR betting podcast. Here are your hosts, Todd Fuhrman and racing analyst Chris Werme.
Welcome into the Stay Green podcast, part of the Bet the Board podcast network, as we break down all things NASCAR around these parts. Chase Elliott, NASCAR's favorite driver, finds his way into victory lane, ending a 42-race losing streak. We talk best bets and have a tremendous in-depth interview about how the three of us can change NASCAR with Alan Cavanna. I am your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by professional NASCAR bettor and racing analyst extraordinaire Chris Werme. And Wormser, I know we'll get to the Cavanna interview in a few, but I think we came up with a revolutionary way to overhaul the sport and have immediate change that could take place as early as 2025.
Yeah, I think that there should just I didn't even realize some of the statistics that were available when it came to pit crews. And
that unfortunately doesn't shock me and may not be information that we wanted to make readily available to people that hang on your every word and guidance as it pertains to getting to the window with some of our best bets, but that's neither here nor there.
It's hard to handicap a good stops, though. I get in this but I do have the debate often with, people that I respect that are, well, with his pit crew, how are you allowed, how do you bet this guy to win? It's like, well, I mean, they're still good, they're going to have to figure it out, but you don't always have a bad stop just because the crew isn't terrible. So, but yeah, that was an interesting conversation with Alan, and clearly I'm shocked when I kind of have this revelation when Alan brings this to our attention. So
yeah, more on that in a minute. For those folks who are tuning in to Stay Green for the first time, we break things up around here. It's typically three parts, all about the race recap in stage one, stage two, normally a race breakdown, but given the unpredictable nature of Talladega, we did things a little bit differently this week. And then stage three, all about ways to make ourselves smarter NASCAR bettors going forward. But when we mention Texas, we know that it is a track that has been polarizing, to say the least, but a welcome reprieve to the short tracks that didn't offer much in the way of fall off, passing, or anything else. There were plenty of drivers that were more than comfortable taking themselves out of contention. Fortunately, we get home with the best bet on race day, a position for us that, we thought we had a rocking chair winner, didn't quite come to fruition. But what were your overall thoughts on Texas? I know, for one, I am thrilled that it is no longer a playoff race. And while I did enjoy it on some level watching it from an entertainment standpoint, I'm happy that it's in a rearview mirror.
Yeah, it's just so strategy based. If you look at, Chase Elliott, now I think that it's very obvious. We can say that he was better than I thought he was going to be. However, he started 24th. He didn't drive from 24th up to first. That's definitely not what happened. He was able to steal some track position by staying out longer and getting a caution. And that's what happens when you find yourself at a track that's as edgy as a place like Texas. And what we mean by edgy is if you find yourself out of the groove or you're trying to get aggressive and make a pass on a car, you could find yourself on a dirty track, and these cars can snap loose. And when you snap loose going 170 miles an hour, chances are you hit the wall. Well, what credit to this Chase Elliott team, what they did was they decided to stay out during a green flag sequence. They stayed out longer, and usually green flag sequences tend to have mistakes or I guess times when cautions are easier. Sometimes you got to have a loose wheel. Look at Kyle Larson. And so they kind of stayed out through this green flag cycle and got themselves a caution. And what that does is that pretty much has them inherit that track position. All these guys that were leading the race ended up a lap down. And the guys that were on the lead lap or had made their way back to the lead lap stayed there and probably pitted and took tires. And the guys that were a lap down had no choice, but instead of pitting, they had to take the wave around to get back on the lead lap. I know that I probably struggle a little bit to describe that scenario, but essentially Chase Elliott stole track position. And and some drivers were able to do that late in the race. You look at some of these, Todd, we don't talk much about driver rating on here, but we, to our listeners, they probably understand how important this is. Well, perfect driver rating is 150. It's hard to get. You can't get over 150. We see very few drivers hit that throughout the year. And this is a metric that I think you can find broken down somewhere. But, the best driver rating in the race was Tyler Reddick at 129.5. Okay. And then you have Chase Elliott.
More on Tyler Reddick and pit stops later in the program.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Don't even get me started there. Chase Elliott was 114.9. You can look at, Kyle Larson was 108.5. Denny Hamlin was 101.2. And then it goes down from there. Brad Keselowski finished second, 79.4 driver rating. That is a really successful finish for a guy with a 79.4 driver rating. Oh, it gets better. Daniel Suarez, the guy in our in one of our bets, 63.8, finished
Nuestro amigo Daniel Suarez. That a boy, 99.
What Chase did to the field, that's what Daniel Suarez was able to do to Eric Jones. He ended up staying out longer, which there's definitely a risk associated with that. However, the caution comes, he inherits that track position, and mi amigo, who is probably his average running position 20th, finishes 5th in the race. So because there's so many different strategies that goes into, I guess running here at Texas, that's what makes it hard to handicap. And that's why it typically isn't our favorite track.
If I had to ask you after watching that full race who the fastest car was, is it Tyler Reddick? Was it Kyle Larson? Was it Denny Hamlin? Was it Chase Elliott? I mean, I don't even know after watching that race back who the fastest car was. Not like it always correlates to winning races, but just the kind of things that we look for to think about, even keeping in mind that what we saw at Texas isn't going to translate to the next couple mile-and-a-half tracks we'll go to.
I would say on equal tires, out of all those guys, whoever got to the lead was almost impossible to pass.
Clean Air was the fastest
Clean
car?
Air, yeah. I mean, Ryan Stevens had a great quote. He said, "Clean air is a hell of a drug," and he's right. In this car, it's so hard to pass. You can aero block. I think just anyone that gets out to the lead that has a top 7 or 8 car, it's going to be really hard to pass. These cars are so similar in a lot of ways that you just can't make up ground on cars that just have the most downforce going into the corner. So I don't know who the best car was. I would say Larson and Reddick. It's tough to argue with those guys. Reddick had a huge lead and a slow stop. He went from damn near a 6-second lead to a 1.5-second deficit.
Giving it all back, and then
you have a
pit stop that's 9 seconds longer than Denny Hamlin.
That's not good. I don't know. I'm glad this track is behind us. It's it's my least favorite mile and a half that doesn't race like a super speedway.
Well, that's a one way to look at it.
But Atlanta was such good racing. Do I like Atlanta more? Even though I still bet Texas, do I like Atlanta more because it actually was a pretty entertaining race? I don't know.
I mean, entertainment value doesn't always correlate to profitability. And
Correct.
I think that's one thing that's a little bit different for the way that we approach race weekends versus the way the casual fan does. When you look at the Xfinity race, I mean, that was one of the more exciting finishes that we're going to get, 0.002 seconds, but it doesn't oftentimes create some of that profitability. We teased the interview for stage 2 with Alan Cavanna. No reason to make all of you guys and girls wait. So without further ado, one of PRN and MRN's most intrepid reporters. Thrilled to welcome back a now podcast regular, making his second appearance here on the Stay Green podcast. Race fans know the name Alan Cavanna. They follow all of his great work across a variety of platforms. You, of course, can follow Alan on X at Alan, A-L-A-N, Cavanna, C-A-V-A-N-A. And Alan, thanks for stepping into the hot seat. We needed someone that could deal with Werme heading into Talladega week, and you seem to be the perfect guest to try and help with that task.
Well, I know he's not in love with the place, but if you've ever been there, you can't not help but fall in love with Talladega. Betting may be a different story. We'll see what we can do.
We had to go through the Texas recap at the top of the show. We won't belabor those points. That's another track that Chris doesn't love, but, in the wake of what we saw unfold, I know a lot of people with Chase Elliott grabbing the checkered flag, ending his 40-plus race winless drought. How much does that change the dynamic, or what's the overall general sentiment on what the expectations should be for Texas? But credit to NASCAR, at least, for moving it out of the playoffs, given the level of
Yeah.
unpredictability and the fact it oftentimes takes on that super speedway feel these days.
Hey, look, Texas had a great weekend. I think they were the big winner, right? They had two great races after a week's worth of coverage about how terrible the place is. But in terms of from the viewer perspective, we had two great races. Even the truck race wasn't that bad. So I think the Texas track itself had a great weekend because I enjoyed the race on Sunday from a coverage perspective, from someone who likes racing, who likes storylines. Look, betting wise, I have learned it's a totally different aspect in how you look at these things. But from a race fan perspective, as someone who likes to tell stories, I thought Sunday's race was awesome.
Chris, I figured you'd have coached up Alan here that anytime there's 16 caution flags in a race, it's never good for anybody that does this for a living. But I know you got a lot of things you want to get to, so I'll let you ask Alan some of the hard-hitting questions you got in front of you.
Well, I just think from the start of the season, what's the biggest surprise to the upside, and what's the biggest surprise to the downside?
Oh, downside has to be the Fords, right? I mean, where are they? How
Mhm.
can you be, the defending champions with two in a row, mind you, right? Joey Logano, Ryan Blaney have won championships. And maybe that's the storyline. Maybe that's how we should be thinking in terms of, Joey Logano didn't do much in his championship season, ends the season a champion. Ryan Blaney took a while
Yeah.
last year in 2023 for him to get started, ends the season as a champion. So are we overthinking it that Ford has nothing, an offer in terms of trophies this year? Maybe, but still, you got to be there, right? You got to perform on some of these playoff tracks that you will come back to, and they just haven't. They're not sniffing leads. They're not sniffing laps led. They're certainly not sniffing victories. So that part is odd to me because they had a nose job in terms of a body style, and something hasn't been figured out yet in the Ford camp. The Toyotas, though, they had a similar change, right? They had a similar body change, and the JGR Toyotas, even 2311, they have a lot of speed at 2311, not as many of the trophies, certainly pit road issues, but JGR not suffering whatsoever when it comes to speed and getting those victories. So that to me on the upside is a bit surprising because anytime you have a big change, you wonder which way it's going to go. Could it go the Ford way or the Toyota way? We've seen both instances.
Well, and we've seen in the last couple of years just finding speed late in the season or just peaking at the right time. We've seen it the last couple of years where, when Larson won, back in 21, he was the best all year. Yeah, he needed that final pit stop to get the lead at Phoenix to win the championship. But what we found is these two Penske cars finding speed late. We could see that again with these same two cars entering into the playoffs. If they can figure out, clearly Ryan Blaney figured something out at the end of last year. He was the fastest at every track we went to. It didn't matter where it was late in the playoffs. Is that kind of the direction of the sport is, hey, just get hot late. It's okay as long as we can survive the season, as long as we peak at the right time.
It seems like that's been the winning formula, right? I mean, it's worked two in a row for Penske after not getting all the checkered flags, after you see JGR and Hendrick get all the race victories, but no championship. I mean, which one counts at the end? And we see that in other sports. It's just still new to the NASCAR mindset, right? That just peaking at the right time or being good in the playoffs is good enough to win you a championship. I mean, we're talking 60 plus years of history where that wasn't the case. So it's still hard to wrap your mind around sometimes. But, I just think of Tom Brady's Tampa Bay Buccaneers that weren't that good in the regular season, go on, win a championship. We see that all the time in other sports.
Yep.
It's still taking a minute for that to rise to the occasion in the mind of a NASCAR fan or a NASCAR bettor. But absolutely, that can happen. And it seems like it's taken a little longer, even for the Denny Hamlins of the world, to finally realize, hey, all we have to do is really be good at Phoenix, right? It's like, yeah, where you been, buddy? Like, that's all these teams really have to focus on is winning that final race and put all of your assets, all of your time and allocation into winning Phoenix, because that's really the only way to win a championship.
Well,
it's always. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
No, go ahead, Doug.
No, I was going to say, you bring up Denny, and I think he's a fascinating example, Alan, because when you look at Denny, I mean, he has had top three speed arguably every week. He's consistently leading laps, but we know the 11 is putting all of his eggs in the same basket to go for wins. But you wonder on some level when it resonates potentially, if at all, that, it's okay finishing second at Texas and making sure that you have a points lead to try and grab some of that regular season title and the points allocation that comes with it instead of finishing 30th. So it's a balancing act between these teams that I have to imagine is extremely difficult to try and figure out, okay, when do we want to go for it and grab all of those race wins versus when do we just want to continue accumulating finishes, because that's the one thing that we can hang our hat on when we get into the stretch of the 10 races in the postseason instead.
And Texas was the perfect example. We won't know how consequential that was until the end of the season. But Denny said it himself. He's doing the math in his head. If he gets a good finish, he's going to get not only maybe a win or a second place, but also the point lead, right? He's going to be in a points position to get that regular season title, the 15 extra bonus points. So maybe you can afford to have a mechanical issue in the final 8 round and still get to Phoenix, where they've proven to be good this year. We saw that earlier in the season. So I hate that's such the anti-racer's mindset, right? To think second is good enough. I don't think that takes a really special decision for a driver to make it 190 miles an hour after 398 miles, all that stuff going through your head to tell yourself second is okay. You kind of need a crew chief. You need some voice in your ear trying to reiterate that to you, that second is okay. Let's not go on the outside. We'll see how consequential that is come the end of the season.
Well, he also brought up a point in Action Sacramento. He was a 50-50 shot of making the corner. And I'm sitting here going, as someone that analyzes risk for a living, if you're 50-50 to win or finish wherever you finished, I don't know how you rationalize that. But there's obviously with the Marcus Smith stuff that was brought out, and the champion, like there has to be a part of Denny that let me go win this damn championship, so that way everyone, what are you gonna hate on me for now? Like I feel like Denny he kind of protects himself by saying, hey, I just want to win races, and that way he doesn't, like, if he lets down expectations or he doesn't meet expectations, he didn't feel like he let anybody down. But there's also a part of me that he could sit up there and say after his championship, he could just say to the fans, what are you going to hate on me now for? Yeah. Like, I've won the championship. Do you think Denny will switch from that let's just win races to maybe figuring out a championship, or is he just going to wait and see if at Phoenix he has a chance?
Well, I think the lessons learned from Texas, there may be something there if they're in that position again, to see how far he can push it. As you said, he thought it was 50-50. His co-host on that podcast then pointed out no one had made it all day on the outside. And we'd seen multiple crashes in the lead, yet Denny still thought it was 50-50. But look, I'm not going to question his judgment. You're going for the win. You're supposed to do that when going for the victory, but you can't ignore the consequences from that and how detrimental that was to his finish, maybe his point standings, all that stuff. It's got to be hard to have that clear of a mind. I've never been an elite athlete like that in that moment, trying to get the win. Wins mean so much in NASCAR. That's what gets remembered. And if it works, you look like an absolute genius, all that stuff. So I can never question that. But yes, there is the reality of what happened to him and how bad that finish may affect him come race 26.
Chris, it's always interesting because when you and I handicap things, we look at a variety of metrics. It's running position, where guys are, which are some of the outlier finishes in terms of, hey, look, if this was a top 5 car, I know it doesn't provide any solace for bettors out there for a guy like Denny. If you have him in head-to-head matchups, he's running second and he ends up finishing back in 30th. It's not necessarily a bad bet. It's a bad beat. But Alan, when you talk to some of these teams, RFK is always the team that Chris and I have a hard time handicapping so far this season, because they seem to get significantly better finishes than what they show in overall race speed. So when you have these discussions with drivers, with crew chiefs, and some of the NASCAR personnel, how are they measuring the overall success 9 races in? Is it looking for race winning speed? Is it trying to get those finishes? I mean, how do you create that balancing act to try and provide an accurate assessment of what you've seen from your race team so far this season for all those programs outside HMS and JGR that we know have had race-winning cars every single week, regardless of track type?
Well, so much of it is just maximizing your finish, right? Teams know what they have before they roll out when they roll out of the hauler. They can almost estimate. It's crazy how much they already know about their car and where it's going to be on the speed chart. They have simulation, they have data, they have everything other than practice, right? But they know where they stand. And I guess maybe they're hoping for a happy surprise sometimes, but there are few surprises when it comes to actual speed. So what do? You have to at least maximize your finish in terms of where you are on the speed chart. You better finish. If you have a ninth place car, you better finish ninth. And if you have a great driver, you're finishing sixth, seventh, eighth. That's a huge victory. I'm thinking of the Brads of the world. Or you could start strategizing, right? And Texas provided those sorts of opportunities when the tire isn't maybe wearing as much, or you've seen two tires work, or a long run, maybe you hit it. Maybe you call that luck. Maybe you call that strategy. But if you don't have the race winning speed, you got to do something else. That's why I like the Texas race, because it at least provided those teams that don't have race winning speed to at least try something. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. We saw, as Todd said, and Chris, the race was flipping at times. Harrison Burton was leading, right? I mean, there were times where people could go long and the top 10 looked so crazy, but Brad Keselowski didn't get a second place finish because he had second place speed or a second place car. They strategized well. They had the track position they needed, and they had the experience up front on a late restart when you needed it. That's the kind of stuff you have to do if you're not one of those teams with elite speed.
And when watching the season so far, I know we touched on the Fords at the top. We always joke a little bit about RCR getting an improbable pair of top 10 finishes to Kyle Busch and Austin Dillon that I don't think anybody believed had top 10 cars. Being around the garage and talking to some of these drivers and teams, is there a team that's hitting the panic button a little bit sooner? Is it SHR trying to figure things out? Is it Team Penske, or do they have hey, look, we've won back-to-back championships, we can take our time? Is it RCR, or maybe even a Trackhouse that hasn't necessarily been able to pick up some of the momentum we saw 2 seasons ago? Daniel Suarez finishing top 5 and Ross Chastain inside the top 2 for the majority of the race. But is there a team that you think is a little bit nervous about how the season has gone through the first 9 races?
I just weigh that with expectations. So in terms of how I answer that, Team Trackhouse should be winning races. Ross Chastain should be winning races. When he doesn't have that yet, that's a little worry, especially with all the Chevy speed that we see out there. Why aren't you as good as HMS, right? Why aren't you as fast? Kyle Busch may be similar. Kyle Busch won 3 races last year, and they were terrible on the short tracks, right? They couldn't get away from the short tracks fast enough. And look, luck, what have you, it'll still say they got a top 10 at an intermediate track. Good for them. Austin Dillon's had terrible luck, but when you're running back, you're sort of making your own luck, right? You can't start back there. You can't qualify back there. So there's some issues there. But again, how many races was the 3 team coming in thinking they should be or were going to win, right? I don't know. So this is all expectation based versus result based. Trackhouse should be winning because they've shown us that. RCR, the top 15s for the 3 team. Maybe some wins for Kyle Busch and crew, but it just seems like the longer we go, Denny addressed this last week on his pod in terms of the longer we go, the bigger the separation gets with the HMSs and JGRs of the world in this next gen era.
How do you think Kyle Busch is responding to just his performance? This is the first time outside of maybe when he started his own Xfinity team where he wasn't in the fastest stuff. How do you think he's dealing with that? You don't see him in the spotlight nearly as much. You don't see him pissed off nearly as much. He just kind of keeps to himself more, but I don't know how he is in the garage area. I have never interacted with Kyle Busch in my life. So just kind of curious how this season is going for him. At least he got early wins last year.
Yeah, that helps.
Not only this, in competing, right? He could have won the Daytona 500. So he had some what if chances. Even in the Clash last year, he was able to drive back up to the top 3. There's not been a glimmer of hope other than this luck of finishing 9th. I mean, his driver rating was 61, with an average running position of 23rd out of Kyle Busch. How's that going in his mind?
He'll always tell you the truth, right? And that you appreciate that about Kyle Busch, even when it's frustrating. But I don't know what's going on inside his mind. You just have to believe it's frustrating in terms of if I see Kyle Busch is running 23rd average running position, do you think that's Kyle Busch or do you think that's the car?
Yeah.
Right. And so that's what I think has to be the most frustrating, is that it's not him. It's not one of the greatest to ever do it that's causing this to get the finishes that they're getting, right, in terms of the speed, in terms of the handling and setup. Again, the terrible run at short tracks that they had. I mean, he's Kyle Busch at Bristol. You should be the best out there. You should expect the top 5, and to not have the equipment under you right now, that has to be frustrating for a driver. Statistically, if you believe in his prime, right? He's getting up toward that age 39. You don't want to waste any of that. So I just have to imagine there's a frustration there because you have all the talent, but it takes more than that in NASCAR. You have to have the team hitting at the same time. And then look, there was good runs. He led laps in Las Vegas, and then there was pit issues both with his team, and then I think he drove through the box one time. So that has to compound the frustration. But I just hate to see it. If it feels like his talent is getting wasted, I have to imagine that has to be the most frustrating thing.
You know, Chris, it's crazy. It's like we talk about every week. We continue to look at the opening odds and you go, when is it all going to click for RCR? And when do you jump in on Kyle Busch at 25 to 1, 30 to 1, 35 to 1 for a lot of the reasons that you outlined there, Alan? Talking about talent hasn't gone anywhere. At least we shouldn't believe it has. But if you don't have a race winning car, you can only try and take a donkey and win the Kentucky Derby so often before ultimately water meets its level. And it's kind of what we've seen. I mean, Kyle Busch had one chance to win a race this year and it came in Atlanta. So you have to wonder if in the RCR camp, they're circling this weekend at Talladega going, you know what? This has to be our chance to try and win a race and take some of the pressure off. But you mentioned, you know, some of the drivers and what they've gone through, and pit crews becoming a bigger and bigger storyline that Chris and I have tried to figure out how we need to handicap them effectively, because when you have so many drivers that are separated by the slimmest of margins, we saw it last week at Texas. Tyler Reddick had arguably the fastest car, and his pit crew doesn't do him any favors. When you look at some of these pit crews that are out there, are you guys paying more attention to that and assessing a team's true viability to win a championship maybe than ever before in the next gen era?
You have to, in terms of getting wins, in terms of when so much of this is about track position. And if you are losing track position, you're going to lose races, and that will come down to pits eventually, even we're talking tenths of seconds here, not even huge mistakes, right? That was the big thing on the 45 lap. I mean, he had such a huge lead in Texas. You just don't fumble the ball, right? Maybe you can go a little slower running around, or you don't jump off the line. Just don't fumble the ball or throw it out of bounds, whatever analogy you want to use. So that coaching has to be there. But again, the analogy of like, hey, we need a starting pitcher. Our team could use one, you know, $100 million starting pitcher. Well, where am I going to find that? You're not going to find it. You just have to hope that you hone your skills and everything. But absolutely, to your point about championships can come down to this when track position means so much. It didn't in Phoenix last year anyway, right? The first car off pit road, it didn't factor in like we had seen it previous years. But in terms of getting to that Final Four in Phoenix, it has to factor in. And that's why the Denny's and the Hendricks of the world will absolutely rise to the top on that factor alone.
I mean, look, I think it'd be fascinating, guys, if we saw NASCAR adopt the elements of some of the stick and ball sports. I mean, if you're front row motorsports and you have an elite fueler that you want to trade for 2 sets of tires or pit placement somewhere along the way, let's amp this up. Let's create a little bit of a reality component to all of this, because I know these guys typically sign long-term deals. And while we see shuffling of crew chiefs and pit crews as we get deeper into the playoffs, there's got to be a way that NASCAR can have a little bit of fun with this and create a component. It's not like we're shipping guys across the country when we had, you know, front row operating out of Denver. You're just moving in terms of what shop you have to roll into in and around the Charlotte area.
Could you imagine? Sorry to cut you off. Like, there's been a trade. JGR has traded their top jackman for 2 future tire changers and a backup fuel man. You know,
I mean, well, there's nothing. I don't think we're thinking about this enough. This seems likely or plausible. That's something I've never thought about before. But why wouldn't teams start doing this right before the playoffs? We see crew chiefs, we see crew swaps within organizations, maybe within manufacturers, but it seems, there are trade deadlines in other sports, that prevents you from going and, whoever wide receiver 1 is out of the playoffs, like, let me put him on my team for the playoffs and let's go win a Super Bowl, stack the deck. That can't happen in other sports. Why couldn't that happen in NASCAR? Why can't you throw a bunch of money at a team? Now, generally, probably the best fuelers, the best athletes are already on these best teams. But if you wanted to grab one from another manufacturer, another team, I'm surprised that hasn't happened yet right before the playoffs to totally revamp a pit crew, because they're so valuable to potentially winning. Now that there's a whole debate on that too, because you could have the fastest pit crew in the world, but you're not faster than a 2-tire stop. So that's a whole other discussion.
The other thing too is maybe they need to start. Do they keep track of pit stats? Like,
oh yeah.
They do. Like, well, I understand that. I know they keep track of of team stats. Do they keep
Everybody
track
knows
of
who the
like
best is.
everyone
Absolutely.
has a oh really? Okay, that'd be interesting. Like there is a hierarchy of who the best
Oh
tire
yeah,
changer is.
100%.
Okay. Well, that's something. I mean, I've only been watching the sport for 14 years. I have never seen something come up like a ranking of tire changers or jackmans. I know, like, if you look back, the one time where I remember specifically a crew member making a championship decision was at Martinsville when Chase Elliott's jackman jumped too soon. He went back and tagged up. Yeah, it did hurt their stop and they lost track position, but they didn't have a penalty. And then he goes on to win at Martinsville and then win at Phoenix. That, to me, that guy deserves way more credit than he got because that saved the championship. Or even Alan Gustafson hey, you need to tag up. Like, how many guys knew that was even a possibility? So as we see these teams get marginally better, where just, like half a tenth of a second on a pit stop is deciding a potential championship or a race off pit road, you start to have to, like, the amount of analysis trickles down even more to a potential jackman change or a
Sure.
trade.
A
That's
tire
just
changer, a carrier. Oh, they have metrics and measurements on them all. That's why some of them can name their own price, and they do, and they're rewarded
really.
quite valuably. Oh yeah.
Oh, I never knew that.
Oh yeah.
This is all new to me. I had no clue.
Yeah, believe me, teams know. It's almost like combine stuff and there's absolutely free agency with pit crews and big contracts. And JGR finally last year started celebrating some of that. Like, oh, we signed so and so to a 3-year $1 million deal. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's been
I'm
wild
like,
to see, and credit to Fox for highlighting some of those guys on their broadcast so far to start the season. You wonder if NBC will continue that, but I can see it now, Chris. I mean, we go into the Coke 600. Tyler Reddick wins the pole. We know how important that first pit stall is at Charlotte. He decides to trade out of it to make sure that he can have a better pit crew. I mean, we got storylines for days if that's the case for some of these teams to try and get there. But I mean, Alan, when we look at the way things have played out, I mean, we keep talking about two racing teams being a cut above everybody else. And if we set the over under at 3.5 JGR HMS drivers being in the final four, I mean, who becomes some of the most likely guys to crash the party? Is it RFK getting it together? Ryan Blaney, of course, we should put in the discussion as defending champion, 23-11. But are there other drivers that you can see kind of trending in the right way, peaking, knowing how unpredictable this playoff schedule will be compared to what we've had in years past?
Yes and no. I mean, so much of it we balance with overall performance, like who's really good driver, right? Versus we have to look at it's those 3 tracks in that final 8 round that determine everything, right? In terms of who makes the final 4. No matter how good you are, you get a win at one of those final 3 tracks, you're one of them. And so I always find that tough to balance out. Yeah, we know who's really, really good and who should be the top 4. It rarely is in terms of who goes to Phoenix. So you have to think of those final 4 races. What are they? Martinsville. Help me out here if you've got the schedule.
Las Vegas, Homestead, and Martinsville.
Yep.
And Homestead, Martinsville, and Vegas. So you can go back to some of them, what we saw early on in the season. 3.5. What did we have last year? We had that one Penske car and the track, and who does well.
Look,
Yeah.
I'm not setting the number at 3.5 flat. Full disclosure, Chris would be hammering under, knowing that what can go wrong often does. I would heavily have to juice the under to go through. But what I think is so interesting now is because Chase, we've maybe thought of as an afterthought, suddenly inserting himself in the conversation, and you begin to look, okay, he was good at Martinsville, he was good at Richmond, starting to figure it out. I mean, Chris and I have had the discussion when you look at the hierarchy of HMS, no disrespect meant to Alex Bowman, but he's a clear number 4. I'm not sure how you stack the other 3 guys up. Is William Byron the number 1 because he gets those finishes? Is Kyle Larson the number 1 because he shows speed? Or do we have to start talking about Chase Elliott, whose average running position this season has been as good as anybody? I mean, it's top 5 in the sport coming in. So it's such a fascinating discussion when we look at that race team, maybe above all else.
It is.
Some of the challenges.
The more I'm thinking about it, there's too many Tyler Reddicks of the world at Homestead, right? There's too many crazy things that could happen at Martinsville with Joey Logano, Ryan Blaney's of the world. Bubba could easily win Las Vegas. So yeah, I can't put the 3.5 number way too high already.
Yeah, the other thing too, if not just that, I feel like that Las Vegas, Homestead, Martinsville is the calmest of all the rounds. If you look at Atlanta, Watkins Glen, and Bristol, That's how you're opening, the round of 16. Then you're Kansas, Talladega, and the Roval. I mean, you could pull a Truex and not find yourself even competing for those final spots. And I think that the playoffs this year, it's also why I haven't bet anything going into the playoffs. Like normally by now, I kind of have someone that I felt like I found some value. Like, okay, this guy's going to be good. We're entering also tracks where this driver's good. I just think that there's a lot of unknowns, and then tack on the fact that the last 2 years, it's just been guys getting hot towards the end of the season. Like, pick your guy who's going to get hot.
Yeah, let me ask you about that in terms of value. You study this obviously more than I do. You do this for a living. The Blaney's and Logano's of the world, those drivers that don't have a win yet, is there value there for a championship pick? Is it there enough yet for you to bet on it? Has it gone low or high or whatever the term is?
Well, not in my opinion, no. Because I just haven't seen anything out of them. The one thing that you cannot win a championship. I don't care how well you execute on pit road. I don't care how good your strategy is. If you don't have speed in your race car, if you're not up there racing for wins late in the season, you can't be there. Like it's just you can't know. Like you said, these teams understand when they unload how they're going to be. You can't go, well, I hope we're good. I hope we have speed. You have to know, like, when you get to the late part of the season, you want to know you have speed. Okay, what are the adjustments?
Knowing how the last 2 years have played out, there's got to be a price for you where you'll pull the trigger and be like, hey,
yeah, there is.
Ryan Blaney, let's go Logano. Let's do this. At that huge number, let's do this.
I think when it comes to, Logano's 16-1. He just, where has he had a car where you're like, he's going to Richmond? But, I do think that there is, to your point, as I talk out loud about this, because of the schedule in the playoffs, I do think that there is a better shot for someone at higher odds to maybe sneak through there. Maybe it's a guy like Ty Gibbs. He doesn't have to worry about speed. That's one thing where Ty Gibbs doesn't have to worry about anything. He knows when he unloads, if it's at a 1.5-mile track, he's going to qualify in the top 10. He's going to make the final, the final 10, and there's going to be speed in that race car. So, guys like Kyle Busch at 22, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole.
Famous last words from you, Alan. We're going to revisit this about 4 weeks from now. And Werme is going to be trying to give out to all of our Stay Green listeners a future on Kyle Busch because he won't be able to help himself. So I'm going to timestamp this. I'm going to mark it down in the annals of podcast history. And we're going to revisit this moment at the start of the playoffs when Werme is all in on the 8 car, potentially finding a way to catch lightning in a bottle.
But look at RFK. They're both like 28-1. They were great in the playoffs last year. If they figure something out, I trust both of them as drivers if they have speed, to figure out a way to get it done. But I still think with it, you have to have speed week in and week out. And if you don't, if you're unloading and you're not quite sure where you're going to stack up, you just can't. I don't think you can win championships. If you go to Las Vegas in the playoffs and you're like a 15th place car and you're in the final 8, I don't think you're winning a championship. Like, you got to go out there and be fast at Vegas. In my opinion, that's the most vanilla 1.5-mile track we have. It's medium tire fall off. It's raw speed combined with some talent at that certain track. But yeah, we've talked a lot about gambling this year, you and I.
Yeah.
What are some of your takeaways so far as you just started into this betting this sport, or at least talking about it?
I understand why you call your podcast Stay Green. Oh my God. I can't imagine the frustration of bettors out there. And the prime example for me was Richmond with Martin Truex. If you were a Martin Truex bettor, and this is unlike so many other sports. I mean, you had a good 40 minutes of thinking, man, if this just stays green, I'm going to win. I'm going to cash this.
Famous last words.
It's looking so good. Like, what could go wrong? All this stuff. And then like what, a 1/2 mile, 500 yards from the white flag, and the caution comes out. I was like, oh my goodness. everything just flew out the window. I'm like, I understand now. Just stay green
Yeah,
from a
just stay
betting
green.
perspective, because everything changed. Martin flew off the handle. And same thing in Texas, man. I mean, once Larson lost his wheel,
Larson, Hamlin, Reddick.
Denny Hamlin, man, just stay green, and you
Yeah.
got this, buddy. And it didn't stay green. And we heard Denny on his podcast. Come on, Ricky, like for
Yeah,
10 laps, just
exactly.
keep the thing straight.
Just keep it straight. It's like my buddies that say, that just bet on sports in general. They're like, could you imagine a golf tournament like the Masters? All of a sudden, Scotty Scheffler's got this 5-shot lead.
On the green.
They're gonna wave a arbitrary colored flag because someone peed in the bushes on 11, and now they had nothing to do with the race. And now you guys, we are gonna let Scotty Scheffler tee off from the up tees. We're gonna let him go. But if he makes a mistake, I mean, anyone behind him that's teeing off behind him still has a shot. They can still, and they just get so very frustrated. What you hope for, this is my TED Talk. You hope that at the end of the season that will equal out. However, if you're good at this, it's actually going to probably work against you in the long run, because if you are saying, hey, stay green, it means you're probably profitable. Now, it doesn't need to be, you don't need to shoot the moon, but profits are profits. It's hard to make money betting. So if you're telling yourself just stay green more often than not, you probably did a good job handicapping the race, which means you can only have more downside risk than upside risk. And so that's the hard part about betting this sport. But from a just understanding the markets in general, we've had conversations about, okay, the odds open, and then you have practice the qualifying, they change. What have you kind of taken away from our conversations that we've had about that?
Yeah, it's been so interesting to learn and see how that works out, and to see how the markets open, how they seem to be always favoring Chase Elliott, right? And there's always a little Chase Elliott bump. Maybe now it's actually meeting those expectations. We'll see how that affects it going forward. So that's been interesting. And there was a long stretch there, and Chris, you pointed it out, where it seemed to be like all the favorites kept winning, except maybe he had been looking for some value. I think you put it there in a very articulate way that I cannot, but win bets are tough, but research and handicapping does pay off, maybe with the matchups and everything. There seems to be some value there if you're good at what you're doing, but the win bets, those are just so tough if these races don't stay green. And I don't know how, as professionals, you can factor that in. Like, how do you factor in chaos to your bets, right? What seemed to be unknown. I think we had a long stretch. It was the longest stretch ever, maybe, of no overtime races, and now we've had 3 in a row, right? How do you factor that into your handicapping? I don't even want to pretend.
Well, you have to look at the track. I did, Texas is not notoriously a great track for us. We don't like to typically bet it. And I think Todd sends me a message like on Sunday morning saying, hey, we have like 4 outrights or 5 outrights at a track we don't like to bet. And I'm like, yeah, but the value. And
no,
you
we
just
agreed
know
prices on all of them. I mean, we didn't bet a single driver at a price less than 14 to 1-ish that we had.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just one of those things where certain tracks do have that potential for chaos late, especially a place like Texas where you don't need help to get into the wall. A lot of these drivers, you got Jimmy Johnson just spinning out on his own, hitting the wall in practice. This is a hard, edgy track. So you never want to take a short price at a track like this where you think there's going to be high variance at the end of the race. But, you get to a place where more like, I'd say, Kansas and Darlington, some of these high tire wear tracks where you racing more the track and trying to have longevity in your car. I think that's a little bit more predictable. You can feel a tire going down, whereas Texas and Dover, those are 2 places where you make a mistake and your day is done. And, we saw that last week.
Look, I think you guys highlighted a couple of the challenges that come with folks that want to bet NASCAR and want to do it with some level of success or take it seriously, is that you have to feel comfortable breaking even for stretches. If you go through 2 or 3 races and you break even, that's not the worst case scenario. The biggest challenge over the course of 36 races, and we don't bet all of them, Alan, by any stretch, it's going, all right, break even, small winner, small loser, avoid that calamity where everything completely goes haywire. and have a couple of those races where you're able to land a 16-1 or 20-1. I think the big challenge for people that get into it as fans, they want to bet some of their favorite drivers each week, which by all means have some fun with it and enjoy the opportunity to kick back and relax, but realize that, look, if you're focusing on the outright market, you may not pick the outright winner for 4 or 5 races, but you don't have to because of the math. If you're able to land an 18 or 19-1 shot compared to, I'm going to just bet the favorite at 4-1, 4-1, 4-1, you suddenly lose 4 races in a row and you're chasing uphill. And, you know, Chris, I saw a lot of that through social media and some of my buddies that do this recreationally, as I'm sure you guys did, for golf. They go, well, you know, you took, 3 or 4 guys at 40 or 50-1, but we could have just bet Scotty at 4-1. I go, yes, if it's that easy, everybody would be doing it and you'd be able to win in a smaller vacuum. But from a macro standpoint, you have to be comfortable with the ebbs and flows that, of course, are somewhat more inevitable in a sport like this than what you'll deal with if you're betting football, baseball, or, even hockey over a shorter period of time.
And that's, the volatility is kind of what I've learned from it. I think of Kyle Larson win bets. It feels like he's either going to win or, get crashed out or something terrible is going to happen to him. Where if like a William Byron top 3 seems far more solid, right? Because it seems like he's either closing at the end and getting the max out of his car, or he gets a win, right? It just, he seems to be there at the end. And Chris has called him very Jimmy Johnson-like. And I agree in terms of getting the most, especially at the end when it's go time. Kyle Larson will get you the victories, but it seems like there's another end to that that's kind of volatile.
Well,
he's a guy you just don't back in matchups. You see a guy like Larson. Yeah, you can take him to win the race because there's a good chance he gets out to a 4 or 5 second lead and leads a ton of laps. But he also makes a lot of crazy mistakes. And I'm not saying this particular week, but in the past we've seen him just make mistakes that most drivers don't make, and that's probably why he generates a lot of speed. So you look for guys like William Byron in matchups because they're consistent. Obviously he's won a lot of races as well, so you could take him to win races as well. But there's certain drivers that are just kind of consistent. I don't think Ty Gibbs is quite ready to win a race, but he's running pretty consistently. So you can see that as well. Where it gets difficult is when you have guys like Brad Keselowski or Chris Buescher, where you just don't know. Sometimes they just disappear. And when I say someone disappears in a race, they just don't talk about them. Joey Logano disappears in some races. There are guys that are just always there. The Denny Hamlin's always there. Larson's
hold on a second. And Chris, we can play devil's advocate because you look at Denny. Denny has just 3 top 10 finishes so far this season. Yeah. And I think that would surprise a lot of people. But he's starting to take on a little bit of that boomer bust mentality. I mean, if I gave people the opportunity to go, can you name some of the drivers that have more top 10s? Bubba Wallace has more. Alex Bowman has more. So Denny's kind of the guy right now that you look at the astronomical prices you have to pay. You may as well bet him to win the race or not bet him at all because some of the matchups, he is such a heavy favorite. And I can only begin to imagine how people felt if they took a flyer on him at plus 170-ish or thereabout in a head-to-head with Kyle Larson. You're up 25 spots going into the green, white checkered flag. And guess what, Alan? Like we talked about variance, you ain't got a chance to cash that ticket when things go haywire. So there are no doubt some challenges that come in there. But before we let you go, and I know last year we had you on for the Chicago Street Course where you were probably the first one to tip up Shane Van Gisbergen. And I don't expect you to be able to repeat that feat here. But when you look at Talladega this weekend, are we looking at another long winless streak potentially coming to an end? I mean, does RFK have to think this is Brad's best chance? What are some of your expectations for Dega this weekend, knowing that it's still one of the most unpredictable races that we'll have on the schedule?
Yeah, I still think skill rises to the top in terms of the plate races, whatever you want to call them now, super speedway drafting type stuff. Ford certainly best chance. I would like that number, right? For them to finally get their first win. Anybody, the Blaney, Logano's, McDowell's. Hell, Todd Gilliland's having a great season in terms of running position. I think I would like to compare his running position where he finishes because he finishes crap. He's got to fix that. But we talk about him during races for the first time ever. So, and he led a bunch at Daytona. So maybe that's a long flyer out there. But based on where they can run, so Ford, I think that's the most likely thing is Ford finally gets its first win this weekend in Talladega.
They're kind of priced that way too. They're priced. I mean, Blaney and Brad are the favorites at some places, and you have Logano right there. So we saw it early in the season. I think that's a good call. It's kind of crazy that maybe Ford has to circle events like this. Like, hey, because we don't have speed week in and week out at some of these short tracks and 1.5 miles, we have to make sure that we take advantage. And so that's why I think just to talk out loud about this, maybe you take them in win prices, but maybe not in matchups, because they're going to want to win. They're going to want to get this win out of the way. And some of these drivers might get a little desperate. Especially, I mean, I think Brad Keselowski, as long as he's not pushing his teammate, I expect him to be very aggressive in order to win a race. So I like where you're at on that with the Ford.
I do think it's cute, Chris, that you mentioned matchups at Talladega, something I never thought was going to come out of your mouth ever on this very show. But Alan, I know we introduced you at the top, but share with our listeners where you're doing a lot of your work this season and where they can continue to follow you outside of social media to make sure they're caught up on all the motorsports development in the Cup Series.
And do you want to spell your name properly for Todd?
Yeah,
I left out an N. I realized I left out an N. I was going to go back and do it. It's 2 N's for the price of 1. So we're in good catch there. Go ahead, Alan. The floor is yours.
Look, just keep up with me on social, but PRN, MRN, Racing America. I got some other stuff coming up soon in May. I'll tell you about that coming up soon. But I'm a little bit everywhere. Serious. We do videos with Chris, trying to do some NASCAR betting 101, get people on the train here. A little bit of everything, and I'm happy to be busy. So that's all I can say.
I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your busy schedule. And I'll correct myself. You can follow Alan on X. That's at Alan, AlanCavanna. Use the second N, otherwise you may not be able to find it. But Alan, can't thank you enough for your time today, making us all a little bit smarter. And when NASCAR finally decides to approve trades, the three of us can say that we were trailblazers on that particular frontier. Great, honest, candid feedback from Alan, like we've come to expect. And Werme, just like Denny Hamlin's midseason bracket caught fire throughout the NASCAR community last year, I'd love to think that our ability that we introduced in NASCAR to trade pit crews for pit stall selection, maybe a set of tires, a couple of wrenches, I think it's something that NASCAR needs to try and create that trade deadline and make these teams better and allow championship contenders to put together the missing link to get them across the finish line, pun intended.
I think that we will have some video that we will kind of put out there on social media, but I was shocked. I didn't realize that they know who the best tire, this is arbitrary. I have no idea the truth of this, but to say, the front tire changer on the 24 team, he's by far the best. Like the way that they break down a golf swing, like if you could do that with, and I'm sure they do, obviously everything in, the professional world like this, you can scrutinize every little detail. I just found it fascinating that it's not talked about more, because pit stops are so important these days. It makes sense to have this information.
Well, the good thing is if you go to NASCAR.com, a website that lacks for ability and ease of finding information, you click on a link for pit road statistic. It's actually blank. So you probably have to poke around to some other channels to get some of that information. And like we said, stage 3 around here is all about a race preview. But when we go to the super speedway that is Talladega, 2.66 miles in the middle of central Alabama, a high-speed tri-oval where anything that can happen often does. You look at the odds this weekend, and I don't think it'll shock anyone that it is a muddled mess at the top of the board, a lot of the household names. This clearly is a track that some of those second-tier racing teams have circled, looking to try and get in a victory lane one way or another. So when we rattle off the favorites, I'm not even going to call these guys favorites. William Byron, Ryan Blaney, Brad Keselowski, Joe Logano, Denny Hamlin, Chase Elliott, Kyle Busch, Bubba Wallace, Ross Chastain, Christopher Bell, Kyle Larson, Chris Buescher, Ty Gibbs, Tyler Reddick, Alex Bowman, all in that 22-1 range or shorter. So handicapping this gets to be a little bit of a fool's errand for us. So Werme, when you look at the trips to Talladega, we talk about the Daytona 500. We know it's NASCAR Super Bowl, the introduction of the 2 races at Atlanta and a 1.5 mile super speedway. What are some of the main reasons that you look to shy away just from trying to extract any value, knowing that, hey, there are some long shot prices that are out there, but it's tough to figure out who may be best on any given Sunday?
Yeah, I think you just take a look at the last 2 Daytona 500s, and guys that we thought were going to be winning the race with 5 to go didn't. And it's just so hard to predict. And you find yourself, with a drafting partner kind of late in the race. And, is that partner a manufacturer, teammate, or are they a direct teammate? Are you Brad Keselowski and you're pushing Chris Buescher across the finish line last year in the summer at Daytona, where you knew that Brad Keselowski was not going to peak out, as the owner of that team, he's going to push his driver to victory. And I found it very difficult to consistently not only beat the market, but also, kind of have a strong ROI. And it's just really difficult for me at these tracks, and they're just not my favorite. I think that, I had a comment on Twitter today that said, that they're watching like the last 30 minutes of a race that they bet on, or the last 30 laps or whatever. I would say at Talladega and Daytona, you can probably do that and catch most of the action. And if that's the case, I don't know that you could have a clear edge betting it long run, but some people do, and they just look at stats and they fire based off of that. I based a lot of my bets off of where I think the market's going to head after practice and qualifying. And I haven't been able to do that very successfully at this particular track.
I mean, I think this is the kind of track where a lot of folks out there that model NASCAR races each and every week get a little bit of an advantage. They're looking to bet into prices, and they're perfectly comfortable knowing that it can have that feast or famine type approach. One thing that I will caution folks who may want to tune in for the final 30 laps at Talladega or Daytona, that could take upwards of 2.5 hours. So plan accordingly. And much like the mistake Werme made a few weeks ago, don't ever tell people you'll meet them when a truck race has 5 laps to go within the next 30 minutes. So there's that for a little bit of food for thought. So rather than breaking down some of the individual drivers, I mean, we talked about it with Alan about who the front runners are this season. And when you look at the standings, I mean, Kyle Larson right now, Martin Truex Jr., Denny Hamlin, Chase Elliott, William Byron, Ty Gibbs, all inside the top 6. But what I think is so interesting that when we look at betting from a week-to-week standpoint, I mean, Denny Hamlin may be up there, but he only has 3 top 10s on his resume so far this season. And you have a lot of, I don't want to use the word inferior drivers, but those driving lesser equipment that are more prone to finishing inside the top 10. So what have you seen for this season from a macro standpoint that you think is applicable as we get to that quarter pull, so to speak? And I guess we'll be further along once we complete Talladega this weekend.
I guess I would just, if we want to take the Fords in general, I think Alan was 100% right that they have to be looking at, what their whole program is looking like. If the top Ford driver when it comes to laps led is just not even the same zip code as the Chevys and the Toyotas. Gosh, where is Joey Logano even on this freaking?
He's towards the cut line.
Where
15th in the standings right now.
Oh yeah. I'm looking at the
one
standings.
spot ahead of your beloved Kyle Busch.
15th, and he's got 177 laps led. That's the top Ford. Compared to some of these guys like Kyle Larson, 531 laps led, Martin Truex Jr., 352, Denny Hamlin, 395. We talked about it earlier with Alan. You have to have speed in your race car. That's not something you can be working on in the playoffs. That has to just, when you unload, you're going to be fast. Okay, now how do we manage our strategy throughout the race? And, how do we get the best possible finish? If you're worried about leading laps, I think that's where you're struggling a little bit. So I think just Fords in general are struggling. Will they figure it out? Yeah, absolutely. I think they will. I think we could see something, like we did last year or even the year before with Joey Logano. However, this car and this format just rewards consistency. And so Kyle Larson is consistently fast, but he's also consistently inconsistent. So, can you afford to be inconsistent 2 races in the round of 8? No, you can't. Not unless you're going to win. So, although I do think he has the most speed kind of week in and week out, I just don't think the system rewards that feast or famine. Same with Denny Hamlin. Look at him last week or at Texas. He has a chance to finish second, but I'll take a 50-50 chance at a win or a DFL. Like
I'm pretty sure the true odds on that particular move from Denny Hamlin were about 90% failure, 10% success. So Denny aggressively taking it's a true coin flip. May want to adjust that math model and some of that risk analysis they were doing behind the scenes.
Yeah, and if we take a deeper dive, RFK, I mean, they're sitting 13th with Chris Buescher in points and Brad Keselowski 17th. They kind of stole a finish last week at Texas. Brad was probably a 15th to 20th place car, but once you get up there, it's so hard to pass that they were able to kind of solidify a good finish. So I think that there's a lot of room for improvement for these Fords, and if they can just kind of maintain and just kind of get these good finishes, like let's just say you take a 15th place car and you get a 10th or an 8th, that really adds up throughout the season. So that way, when you do find speed and you do find yourself in contention, you know that you can maybe be a little bit riskier or take that 50-50 shot that Denny was talking about, knowing that you've kind of maximized your points throughout the year. And so I'll be interested to see, you know, Brad Keselowski's behind Kyle Busch in points. I just don't see a world where Brad Keselowski doesn't beat Kyle Busch in points with the way that RCR is running. I think he's got to get better. I think Joey Logano is just one ahead of Kyle Busch.
Well, Joey had that disastrous start to the season. So the fact that he's already, redeemed himself after finishing 32nd at Daytona, 28th at Atlanta, and 34th at Phoenix. I mean, the 22 has rebounded quite nicely and has strung together 4 straight races where he's finished no worse than 11th.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point.
Yeah, that's the one thing about NASCAR. Maybe, more so. I shouldn't say more so because you see it in a lot of other sports as well. You have to be peaking at the right time that we talked about with Alan. And, as long as you put yourself in a position to get a seat at the table and be one of those 16 drivers that gets a chance in the postseason, make sure you're trending up. We know that teams are going to start tinkering with things as we get to the summer races. Certain tracks are harbingers of things to come. And, if you have that blueprint for what's going to allow you to be successful at Phoenix in your back pocket or Martinsville, then you're going to be one step ahead of the rest of the field, Vegas included as well, knowing how important those races are to wrap up the campaign. You can follow Chris on X at Chris Werme 15. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there for all things Bet the Board. Be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And Worm, we gave all of our listeners 100 reasons why they shouldn't be betting Talladega and just watching this weekend's fans. But that's not going to stop me from giving them a little bit of an educated opportunity to have some skin in the game. And we saw one long losing streak come to a screeching halt, much to our delight on some level with Chase Elliott last weekend. Gets us halfway to the over 1.5 wins that we bet this particular season. We now have, by quick math, 27 races left to get that thing across the finish line. So I like our odds in that regard. Let's end another long losing streak this weekend in Talladega with Brad Keselowski to grab the checkered flag. Checkers or wreckers at Dega. Brad, we know, typically keeps himself out of trouble as best he can. The Fords have shown single car speed, at least at Atlanta and Daytona, so the qualifying efforts can be there. And if Brad has an opportunity up front, I think he's going to do everything he can and then some to race himself around once that white flag comes out and try and find his way into victory lane like we saw with a Ford last time we were at Talladega, albeit the 12 of Ryan Blaney.
Yeah, I like it. I want to see Brad win. I trust him as a driver. I think he gets a lot out of his race car. I think, man, I wonder what would happen if he is pushing Buescher at the line. Does he actually take a peek? And you know what? I think if you're Chris Buescher, you got to just let him go. Like, hey, just he decided in the past he was going to push you to victory. And maybe you don't go down and try to block your boss. Maybe just let him get that win because that could jumpstart and turn around the whole season for him. So winning does solve a lot of problems in this sport. And I would love to see Brad Keselowski get back to victory lane.
So Brad will be our pick. Again, tread lightly. Don't bet big. I'd bet even smaller than you typically do.
Oh, yeah.
On some of our pre-week best bets that we offer up here on Stay Green. And do shop around for the number. I've seen Brad as low as 10-1 at some shops. I've seen him as high as 14-1. Entertainment value as much as anything else to try and get you across the finish line there. But Wormser, big week on deck, though. After Talladega, we go to one of our favorite tracks to bet.
Yep.
The Monster Mile at Dover, the concrete high-speed oval. We have a special guest lined up as well there that we're looking forward to talking to again, who should be able to provide some perspective, but hopefully a lot more in the way of actionable information for Dover than what we were able to provide this week at Talladega. Other than, again, like I said, revolutionizing the sport and creating a trade deadline that NASCAR so desperately needs.
Yeah. That's Dover's the reason I like Dover is it's so unique relative to a lot of the other tracks. I know that you do have the same concrete as you do it at Bristol and in Nashville, but cars can catch a setup there. And I think that a lot of Dover is getting in a rhythm because you're running these such fast laps and such a short track that certain drivers do just excel here. And we saw Jimmy Johnson and Matt Kenseth be exceptional here. We do see some other guys. I don't want to give away, who else we would like Todd did. But we think Chase will be good as well.
Well,
it'll be
no,
interesting.
hold on a second. Let's peel back the curtain there with the Chase Elliott story. I said, you know what? Chase won a little bit earlier than I anticipated because I would have loved the opportunity to get him at the potential price that may have been offered that will no longer be available on the 9 car for the foreseeable future at any track type as he continues to put together some consistent runs. I think the days of us getting Chase Elliott, even after practice when he's driving a donkey around of 25-1 aren't going to be there. You look at the 9 car, 5th place at Richmond, 3rd place at Martinsville, comes home with the checkered flag at Texas. And oh, by the way, over the last 5 races, his average finish of 6.6 is amongst the best in the entire series. So Chase Elliott, market inflation, long gone, compadre.
Yeah, it's gone. But yeah, I'm looking forward to Dover. And one of the, I love all of our guests, but this one I think is one of my favorites.
All right. So that's big show on tap next week for Dover. Again, best of luck for however you guys and girls choose to build your race card this weekend at Talladega. Tread lightly. There will be better investment opportunities as we get deeper into the schedule. May, usually a very interesting month with some of the track types that we will go to.
Great
so for Chris Werme, what'd you say?
Great. I love this next stretch of races.
Yeah, what do we have? I don't have the schedule from. We get a little Dover. We get a little Kansas. I know Charlotte at the end of the month for the 600. What else we got? I'll
just pull it up here because I just get so excited for this part. Dover, Kansas, Darlington, Charlotte, Gateway, Sonoma, Iowa, Loudon, Nashville. Oh,
all right.
Everything's
dust off those bankrolls, ladies and gents. Dust off those bankrolls. We'll have plenty of bullets to fire from now until we get to that Olympic break.
And we get the Brickyard again this year. That's exciting. Ooh, I'm all excited now, man. I enjoy the rest of this week off, and then I'm going to get right back to it at Dover. We got some great tracks coming up. I think this is the kind of the meat and the potatoes of the year, and it's hands down my favorite stretch of races.
Go enjoy a nice bottle of red, or in your case, a box. Whatever tickles your fancy to get you through the weekend. So for Chris Werme, I'm Todd Fuhrman. Thanks to all of you guys for tuning in. Be able to share the podcast with your friend, your family, and anybody else you may or may not like. It helps us out a ton. Go to Apple, offer up a 5-star review, and remember, share some of your comments there. We'll try and get to some of those in podcasts going forward as we try and make everyone a smarter NASCAR better. But most importantly, with a ticket on the 6 in hand, I'm Brad Keselowski this weekend from Talladega. We'll see you at the window.